So, very good evening to the debaters who are the finalists for the Frankenstein debating competition. And now, Calix, you've also hit a evening time zone, hopefully. So, good evening to you once again. Thank you so much for being here and taking out the time with all of us.
My pleasure.
The fact is that all of us thought deeply about the topics that we wanted to have for debate. And we know that we are at the tipping point in a fight against the climate change. And though we know that the awareness is very high, we are hearing it a lot more. You know, the corporates are talking about ESG, sustainability is a major theme across majority of the corporates. $4.6 billion has been kept aside to make sure that either corporates are implementing sustainability within their own businesses or are implementing it for their clients as well. The fact is that more than ever before, we must make sure that we need policy to bring the awareness in use and across the world. And when I mean across the world, I mean political parties are emerging and winning elections in the name of climate change. But is that enough? Right? So we need to be able to move to implement this quality of policies that we are hearing about. So we are hearing a paradigm shift. We started the Frankenstein theme of debating last year. But the fact is that it needs to have more teeth in how it is getting implemented. We know that policies are about incentivizing people to change their behavior, and technologies. How do we harness the powers to make that happen, right? So the awareness is the first pillar that we've ticked off, which is about advocacy and information. It has to get into more actionable. We will devise a Planet X program going forward where you will have an opportunity to show action around it. But now, and for today's conversation, we are going to make sure that you have an aggressive and a meaty debate on it. So before you begin, I do want to make sure that you formally know who you're being adjudicated by. We have Alex Bucher, and you've already had a taste of an adjudication for the junior group, but I do want to introduce him again. He studied politics and economics in the University of Potsdam and is a member of the Berlin Debating Union. And an impressive list of debating achievements include ESL Grand Final in WUDC 2020, ESL semifinals, Open Partial Double Quarter Final at EUDC 2019, and the list goes on. It's quite long. And major achievements obviously include being as a judge in over 15 plus tournaments and being a CA of tournaments like Kingsbury, Maastricht, and Bad Burnham. So if you know better, you realize these are some of the most competitive debating competitions and the prestigious ones as well. And Calix, with that, I love welcoming you again back to the forum. So here are our aggressive minds. Before we begin, it'll be lovely to give them a perspective on how you've seen the benefits of debating communities, clubs, and mentors to shape the debaters. Because, you know, I would love it if some of them just go formal onto their journeys, which I know some of them will. We can see that buds at all. So it'll be lovely to get that perspective from you, especially with WUDC happening. And the fact that you're anyways enjoying a lot more offline for tournaments. If you can just spend a minute or so and then we can begin our...
Thank you, I'd love to. So I started out debating with this classical idea of I want to stand on big speeches and with a nice suit and be admired by crowds. I did get that, to be perfectly fair, but ultimately what kept me staying and debating is the ridiculous amount of things that I didn't expect to gain along the way. One is that I very rarely by now get misunderstood. Whenever I want to express my opinion, whenever I want to say something, I can be pretty certain that people will understand exactly what I want to say, exactly what I want to communicate, especially as when I was a little bit younger, my early 20s and late teens. This was an incredibly improvement of my quality of life just by making sure that I wouldn't be misunderstood. So that is one thing that people tend to underestimate. The second that I couldn't really predict was just how fascinating and interesting this community was, and how you start, just because you under short periods of time have to think about complex issues, you start noticing how much quicker you get and how analytically you very comfortably just kind of get into deep, difficult questions. That has been incredibly enriching. But beyond that, just the sheer amount of people that I got to meet over the years. I have quite a few very close friendships. I even met my girlfriend through debating now for 5 years and counting. Our next step is trying to find an apartment together and actually properly settle down. So all of this is something that I got from debating, especially just for you to properly get into in-person tournaments and actually staying in the scene. you will very rarely have the opportunity to find so many people that are interested in the same things as you, that are as passionate and excited about and curious about the world around you as other debaters will be. Plus the huge upside of them also being from diverse social backgrounds, from diverse places around the world, and you therefore getting access to experiences and perspectives that otherwise I frankly don't know how you would get them. And that has probably been the most enriching thing for me from debating. Beyond that, there's also just this really fun thing that debating has very clear rules and very clear setups, and you can get to understand the format better and better. So you have this feeling of exploring this complicated strategy game step by step. And this is something that does transfer into other circumstances. So whenever I have to, I don't know, speak in any occasion or think about or like have to write an essay, you become a lot more aware of what exactly the rules are, who exactly reads them, who exactly adjudicates them, and how you change everything according to that. And that is something can be incredibly fun, just in terms of competing, but it also just always makes you aware kind of a more external perspective about those structures. So these are all things that I got through debating, and I'm incredibly grateful for having gotten through debating. And I hope that you get to do that too. Obviously, lastly, it's made it a lot easier to argue with random people. And in particular, one experience that all of us have probably made is getting into a discussion with someone, talking past each other, and it getting very frustrating, and it escalates more and more and more. If the more you know debating, the less that will happen, because the easier and the quicker you can understand exactly where the problem with the discussion is and why it's not progressing, and then deal with that core issue. Plus, if the other person is just no one you want to discuss with and don't want to argue with, you find out way quicker and save yourself so much time and effort. So for all of these reasons, stay in debating. You've made a good choice.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I do want to spend 1 minute just to say the reason I moved from consulting. I was running digital consulting teams for a large conglomerate across 84 countries. The reason I pretty much moved into building this business was because we saw that two students coming in from the same institute had the same technical skills, but they didn't have the soft skills. And the soft skills literally are the 4 C's, that your ability to assimilate your mind and put forth a point are the human skills that are going to differentiate you. You know that the robots are coming in not only for the manual cognitive tasks, the cognitive tasks that can all be put into algorithms. I do want to make sure that you understand that an algorithm, which is in deep knowledge in Singapore, has been set up as a board member. There are board members losing jobs to algorithms because of their ability to compress. So you better harness your human skills. It's not a skill that you'll be doing only for debating. You will do it for life any which way. So I didn't realize the spouse or the partner repercussion to this. This is good. I love that example, Alex. But from a professional life, you'll use it any which way, and you will see the difference. So I don't think we need to motivate them more. Let's get on to the debate. All right. So what is this team debating about? This team is debating about the motion that this house would have scientists make environmental policies, not politicians. And the structure of the debate is that all the speakers are doing 8 minutes, Alex. The reply speeches are 4 minutes, and you're obviously entertaining POIs. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fun without it. And this is the 10th to 12th grader, Alex, so they will call upon the speaking orders. I'll leave it to you and to the teams now to take over. Is that all right?
All right. Thank you very much. So first of all, just for me to be able to take down the names. In proposition, who speaks first?
Guhan, Madhu.
All right, perfect. In opposition, who's the first speaker there?
Sheryl.
All right. Second speaker for proposition?
Nandana.
Nandana, perfect. And for opposition?
Sai Sri.
Sai Sri, or
you can just call me Sai. That's enough.
Right,
short and sweet.
I will inevitably butcher some names. I'm sorry for that. All right, then third speaker for proposition?
Vyas.
Vyas, all right. And for opposition?
Sneh.
Sneh, right?
Right.
All right, perfect.
It's the edge.
Now, lastly, on proposition, who does your reply speech?
Me again, Guhan.
Perfect. And on opposition?
Sheryl, speaker 1.
All right, perfect. Then, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Guhan to open the case that stands in his name. Here.
Thank you. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, when environmental experts make a policy, they have the environment in mind and make an environmental friendly policy. When politicians make a policy, they have the next election in mind, and instead they only make people-friendly policies. We at Team Proposition stand for a world where policies and laws are passed in relation to the environment, where they will actually be beneficial for the environment and for the people by the method of these policies being made by scientists and not politicians. Before moving on, I will define the motion for our side and set the roadmap and model. In proposition, we define environmental policies as those that refer to long-term policies regarding the environment, specifically the preservation of flora, fauna, important ecological sites, and actions that are related to the entire international environment, and not just specific to one country or region. We will also not regard resource extraction as part of our side, as it is an immediate decision that directly affects the people in the short term. And in terms of setting the model, we will also, in terms of the scientists, the panel of scientists for our side will be nominated by the Prime Minister or President, depending on the country, and then will be voted upon by the Legislative Assembly, which in India, for instance, is the Lok Sabha. After such nominations, they will serve until retirement or until passing. There will be a specific post reserved for an expert of each of their respective fields, not now. Yet they can be impeached if the council votes and finds a member of the panel's contributions to be negatively affecting the people of the country. Following this, there will be a trial where if the member is found guilty, they will be discharged and subsequently replaced. The actual decision-making process of this council, however, will be completely independent, similar to how the judiciary works today. However, unlike legislation, this is not a panel that will be standing continuously all throughout the year, and instead will be specifically called upon in times of need and discussion. In terms of the roadmap, I as speaker 1 will be talking about how, number 1, politicians are simply not capable of making these decisions in relation to the environment. And number 2, how scientists are by far the best alternatives. Speaker 2 will then be touching upon why the people of the country not having an active say in the long-term environmental policies is in fact actually beneficial. And this leads me to my first argument, because politicians simply are not capable of making these decisions in relation to the environment. Because first of all, of course, politicians simply do not possess the expertise or knowledge required to make such well-informed decisions in relation to the environment. Instead, scientists are far better people to make these decisions and policies, because they have in practicality devoted their entire life towards these fields. They have studied these subjects, these expertise for years and decades and decades. They possess unparalleled knowledge, and politicians simply do not have this in-depth information to make good and beneficial policies. Number 2, politicians, however you cut it, will always have a level of allegiance and bias, especially in terms of foreign relations and international relations, because these politicians will always think in terms of their own country first, whatever they can do to benefit their own country specifically, which could even be at the cost of other nations, especially those they are not on best relations with, while scientists would have far more incentive to have an overall international beneficial outcome for their environmental policies. Number 3, politicians have a limited time in office. It could be 4 years, 5 years, they could be re-elected, but in terms of the long term, they simply do not last. Even if they are re-elected multiple times, we define not yet. We define long term as over 20 to 30 years. And politicians will not have the foresight, and in fact, they'll be de-incentivized to have such long-term benefits, de-incentivized, because these positive benefits would then be credited outside their own term in office. And instead, they really would not have the foresight. They will not make long-term beneficial policies that will actually benefit the environment, even in terms of sustainable development. Number 4, the reason why we are saying this specifically for the environment, that is experts and scientists should come up with these policies, for the environment, and we are not saying this should be done for other fields, is because other fields do not, other fields impact the people of the country far more directly and individually influence their lives. We at Team Proposition are not saying that the environment does not influence people, but we are saying it is a more indirect and long-term benefit compared to other sorts of laws and policies. I will take a POI now.
A direct benefit of having ecological laws to the people is the fact that the employment also is generated, and also you have ecological companies directing the markets. How is that not a direct impact to whatever side opposition proposition characterizes a direct impact in the very first place?
Right, thanks for bringing that up. I'm actually going to refer to this later in my speech, and Team's speaker 2 is also going to talk about this. But the main thing is, people in general, the regular person is not going to, again, is just simply not going to have the foresight to properly understand what policies will be needed and what will not be needed. They will have more individually based requirements, something that will only work in the short term, while environmental scientists, on the other hand, will have far longer term benefits, which will also help the people in the short term. We're not saying it's not, but if people are directly considered for the, if people's opinions are only considered for the passing of these policies, and only short-term policies can be passed, because people would not again have the long-term scope and vision to pass these long-term policies. Thank you very much. And now I will not be taking any more POIs in my speech. I will move on to my second argument. I talked in my first argument about how politicians are not adept to make these policies and decisions. And now my second argument, I will talk about why scientists, on the other hand, are the best alternatives and the best people to make these policies. Because first of all, the environment is obviously an important stakeholder of this debate. And scientists who specialize, who have expertise in their specific fields of the environment, are by far the best people to take this this policy and decision-making process, because they understand the environment the best, far more than any other individual in their country. They will be the best suited and the most knowledgeable to make decisions about the environment, and especially make policies that will benefit the environment, not just in the short term, but also in the long term. Number two, they are also far more committed to their own field, having again studied it for decades and decades. They are completely benefited with their field, and unlike most other politicians, they will have an in-depth knowledge in their field. And again, due to them being scientists and ecologists, they will have the inbuilt incentive of being morally connected to their field. And so when they pass these policies and decisions, they will be far more rational and morally impactful compared to those of politicians who have little to no connection with the environment at all. And Team Proposition, as we have already provided their inbuilt incentive of these scientists to pull up actually beneficial laws and decisions, we are even being very charitable with Team Opposition. There is of course also the added incentive of them being able to be held accountable and responsible by impeachment policy, as I mentioned in my model. And unlike other fields, environmental issues are objective, and there's people, that is as the POI was asked before, this is my reply as well. As people, it is very objective. So when people are going to be taken into account fully, they may not be able to make proper policies and decisions, and will not understand the entire issue. Throughout my speech, Team Proposition, I've told you exactly why politicians are not the right people to be able to make decisions, why scientists are. Politicians are good in writing speeches. Experts are good in writing policies. Ladies and gentlemen, let people do what they are good at, so that the world and the environment will be better for the future. Thank you, and proud to propose.
All right. Thank you very much for a very fine speech. I'd like to now welcome the Leader of Opposition to the front, Sheryl. Here.
Yeah, just give me a second. I'll switch on my timer. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. A very good evening to everyone present here. This House, as the opposition, would have politicians make environmental policies and not scientists. Starting off with the counter model, according to the opposition, there will be an advisory board of environmental scientists marshaled through a collegium system. These scientists will be distinguished in their niche fields. The advisory board presents a report to the parliament outlining the major environmental concerns facing the nation and the world at present during every single parliament session. This report will be discussed and deliberated by the representatives in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, as is any item present during a parliamentary session. This model is the best of both worlds because it deploys everything that the scientist has to offer in terms of knowledge and bipartisanship, while also staying true to the principles of democracy and preserving the best interests of people. The proposition's case will prove why laws made by scientists alone do more harm than good. As the first speaker, I will be outlining how these policies will turn out to be important due to their impracticality, unrepresentative nature, and isolated perspective, how it transgresses the social contract theory and the tenets of democracy itself. The second speaker will elaborate on the merits of the policies created by politicians, which include creating a social paradigm shift and also the extensive pitfalls of the scientist-created policies at the pipeline level itself. Now, moving on to the rebuttals before I continue with my constructors, starting off with the props model. Their model is basically the model followed by the Supreme Court of the United States. And this model does not necessarily defy a checks and balances system that is necessary for the integral working of any body, let alone a body in a democratic nation. They also stated that politicians are incapable of making well-informed decisions and scientists are much more capable of these. As my speech would elaborate, though we do agree that scientists possess unparalleled knowledge in that field, they do not possess social knowledge. Any policy or any governmental decision made has multiple stakeholders in it, and the government has to consider all these intersectional stakeholders while creating a policy and not only their niche interest or their niche expertise. Environmental scientists also, as stated by the proposition, stated that environmental scientists have an impact on foreign policy and they would care more about a global impact rather than a national impact. And this is not necessarily true. Each environmental scientist will differ from their planning skills and their focus, and environmental scientists do not certainly have more of an impact on foreign policy more than any government itself. Also, the proposition stated a factually incorrect statement that politicians don't make any long-term development policies. This is extremely, number one, subjective and factually incorrect, especially considering the fact that India has had a lot of 20-year plans made throughout the tenure of our democracy. And lastly, the proposition stated, not right now, the proposition stated that ecology does not impact people as much as other sectors do. This is number one, factually incorrect, and the rest will be explained in my speech. In the opposition's worst case scenario, there is a heightened chance for progress and any governmental decision made will be at least legitimate in the sense that there is an accountability mechanism and it is representative and not arbitrary. In our case, governments are active because the people are more likely to be respond, be it in terms of protest or in agreement. However, in the proposition's world, none of this is guaranteed. They create a world where this narrative of environmental policies alienating the government from serving its people is augmented. I will be speaking right now on how policies that are primarily framed by scientists do not work because A, they are unimplementable, and B, socially unacceptable and politically unrepresentative. A phrase that all of us would be familiar with is that no knowledge is much better than half knowledge. And even if the unrealistic worst case scenario that prop is pushing, where politicians have absolutely no knowledge becomes true, this proverb makes our case for us. Half knowledge, as the environmental scientists have, does more harm than good. Let us first look at why prop wants scientists to make environmental policies. It is because they have the environment in mind and are more skilled, right? The cardinal problem with this is that however knowledgeable scientists are in that field, they are not qualified in any other field that intersects with environment or is impacted by any environment law that is enacted. In the real world, environmental laws play much differently than they do on paper. They have multiple stakeholders, including industries, people, tertiary sector companies, and even other nations when you take international relations into account. Any policy that is intersectional and includes a lot of stakeholders needs those representatives there. And this is why every single nation has a parliament with diverse portfolios representing diverse interests and don't have experts in a niche field creating a particular law, because these experts are a science expert in this case, not a holistic expert. And their inexperience in other fields impacts each and every individual in a very personal level, because regardless of what the law is, at the end of the day, its intricacies will impact each person, be it carbon tax, daylight savings, or general environment protection acts. If only experts in fields who are not elected make laws, it would be detrimental to the society as a whole because it isolates the basis of what makes a stable nation. That is the social contract theory, and in the present paradigm, also democracy. The lawmaking process.
You're right.
Not right now. In the lawmaking process, the interest of the society and the interest of the state meets. Society needs a stable legal system and the state needs the approval of the society. This lawmaking process is a complex one. And since the state plays the leading role in it, an adopted act is considered the act of a state. And the social contract theory makes this involvement non-arbitrary. One statement made by renowned political philosopher John Locke encompasses our concerns cogently. He says there can be no subjection to power without consent. Though once political society has been founded, citizens are obligated to accept the decisions of a majority of their number. Such decisions are made on the behalf of the majority by the legislature, though the ultimate power of choosing the legislature rests with the people. It is important to note that the social contract exists only between an elected legislature and the people. The people are obliged to obey only civil governments, and their rational consent exists only for these governments, elected governments, to assert their authority to protect the civil rights. It does not include unelected individuals that draft regulations which will dictate the life of people by large. The dominion that these unelected representatives hold is number one, not consensual, and number two, not authority that will protect the self-interest of the society because the society did not choose for themselves. It isolates the basic right of the people to have liberty over their own life by choosing their representative and transgresses the main two tenets of democracy, by the people and of the people. This makes the whole principle that Prop is pushing morally wrong. An important reason for the social contract to exist is to ensure the accountability of the government. The government is held liable because the legislations that are passed is the action of the government that impacts the people directly. According to the Prop model, this burden is shifted from the government to these individual scientists that are arbitrarily elected. Governments that are already grappling with accountability will atrophy further because these actions are not theirs, and it becomes that much easier to shift the blame and not take up the responsibility of enforcing the legislation because the legislation itself was not an act of the state. Both my arguments, if transposed to reality, will take abhorrent turns because these are the very concerns of private organizations and the predominant right wing right now. Enacting the policies of the proposition will not only validate their concerns, but also be the dawn of the fall of the Green Movement. When policies are not endorsed by the government and not accepted by the people, it has no life. It makes no impact. It hampers development and spotlights skeptics who discredit science. It does not present change and leaves no room for true policies, which are not only scientifically sound, but also practically sound. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Second, now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to the front here. Yes, Nandana, sorry.
Yes, thank you. Just give me a moment to start my timer. Am I clearly audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. In the words of my first speaker, politicians are good at making speeches, experts are good at writing policies. So why let people just make them do what they're good at? To begin with, I would like to state that I'm going to do integrated rebuttal to the points of which the opposition has stated that the proposition has in fact declared a model that is anti-democratic. So that will be doing integrated rebuttal, and my other points I will rebuttal as the speech moves on. Firstly, to defend our model, the opposition stated that their counter model would be an advisory board, which is essentially defending the status quo. So now, what are the issues that this poses, or why is this not advisable? Firstly, the proposition would like to make clear that the politicians are not stated as incapable, they are just stated as having different abilities when it comes to solving environmental issues. And about this advisory board, right, there are two major reasons why this would not work. Firstly, let's look at the best case scenario, wherein the politician actually understands these intricacies of these extremely scientific issues that are absolutely not laid out in layman's terms. Right? These are issues that have very hard back scientific evidence that unless you have a scientific background, it may be difficult to comprehend. Best case scenario, they understand what it means. But now, it is always important to know that the government, or in this case, the politicians, in fact, their priority will always be their people. They will always want the best interest of their people, and essentially to get re-elected. So what will they do? They will make these. They will make these environmentalists and these scientists to rework the policies to fit into their elected model. But that's not how it works, because that simply hampers progress. Now, worst case scenario, they simply do not understand the extent or the gravity of the matter in itself, which is a far greater risk than anything else that this debate could possess, because ultimately this is about the environment and ensuring that there is steady progress made. The opposition used the term the best of both worlds, and this is clearly rebutted due to both of these scenarios that I proposed to you. Now, let's move on to the second thing about how no knowledge is some knowledge. You see, this is a very interesting idea with respect to this debate, right? Because essentially both sides are debating exactly this. But let me ask you this question. Is not knowing what the actual issue is greater than not being able to implement it? Without understanding how this issue works or how it can be solved, there is no way that you can actually move towards implementation. Now, talking about implementation, proposition gave you a very clearly well-defined model that ensures that these scientists have credibility and accountability. How is that? We explained to you very clearly that this is a democratic process. Not now. We explained to you how there will be a clearly elected, right? They are not a random group of scientists who are picked up. They are nominated by the Prime Minister and they are further voted upon. And they are in fact going to work just like a democratic body, because essentially it is the people's choice. It is the choice of the people that the people themselves have elected through very democratic process, has this been brought up. Therefore, the accountability is actually much greater on our side. And if you think about the accountability on opposition's house, right? On opposition side, the kind of accountability we are seeing is of the politicians themselves. And I need not bring this to the forefront to tell you that this does not really work, because the status quo right now, one of the biggest problems you're facing is corruption with regard to these politicians and issues such as this. Not right now. I will be telling you when I'll be entertaining POIs. So coming back to what I was saying about the accountability of these politicians and the government's hold right now, that is one of the biggest problems you're facing. Now, how is this completely, or at least on a much better effort on our side, is explained to you by how these politicians and these scientists are actually held accountable by even the possibility of an impeachment process that we have clearly spoken to you about. And the ultimate power of choosing legislature, in the words of the opposition, does in fact lie with the society. And on that note, let me move on to my argument. So the public does not have direct decision-making abilities. Now, why is that a good thing? Firstly, the most important and the most fundamental idea of this debate is to understand that this is about the environment that has such varying topography and ecosystems and whatnot, that the science behind it is so, in fact, agree on the fact that there are environmentalists for each and everything. Now, why is that the public and this do not really go on the same field? Let me tell you how. So the public ultimately, although they might be environmentally conscious, okay, let's take the best case scenario of a public being very environmentally conscious people, very environmentally aware. Now, let's talk about how they would ultimately only be interested in their short-term benefits, right? If you see voting polls today or anything put forward by any politician or any plastic, promote the use of polythene bags and whatnot. These are all completely short-term plans. Yes, they do contribute to the bigger picture, but ultimately this is about environmental policies, right? And like we defined, these are all about long-term policies that we are looking at. Now, how is that this is benefited by the proposition? In these long-term benefits, the public must not have a complete or arbitrary say, because they are always going to be concerned about short-term benefits and how it affects them. Just like the politicians, the public too will only have a short-term view. And it's not fair of us to be thinking that far ahead, because if you think about it that way, the public has known about these issues faced by the countries, by the entire nation due to the depletion of the ozone layer and whatnot since time immemorial. So we've been learning this since like forever. Now, why is that this hasn't worked? Are working right now, that these environmental policies are not being made in the right manner. Now, another thing about the public. So we live in a world where everything we need is just a tap away. Why is this coming into this debate? So the public will always want an easy life. Of course, they would want to benefit the environment, but ultimately easy does not equal eco-friendly. And this is seen even through other cases. Let's talk about how there are a lot of companies today that actually claim to be very eco-friendly, but ultimately what they are doing is something called greenwashing, where they claim to be eco-friendly and the public falls prey to this. This exact manner of greenwashing can also apply to when these politicians propose these policies. And now I'll be taking a POI.
Which exactly is the stakeholder that would be working at the local level to do the change in regards to environmental pollution, which would be essential for this policy to actually succeed? And is your side, through your model, actually able to interact with that stakeholder?
Thank you for your POI. So firstly, to understand this is about making the policy. It is the scientists that are in charge of making the policy, right? That is the very fundamental step that comes into this debate. And secondly, this is taken care of when you think about how they're actually, these scientists are best equipped to make these decisions. And ultimately, it is the environment that is most benefited through this process. So about how these scientists do have the best interest. So let me explain to you how these scientists have a dual obligation. Firstly, the obligation to the environment itself, which you see is the profession that they have chosen, right? They also have an obligation because ultimately the scientists are the public too. So why will they do anything or make any policy that they know is detrimental to human life as it is? Because ultimately no decision on environment can be directly against that of the public. Ultimately telling you that all the stakeholders are well taken care of on our side of the house. Coming back to my argument about why the public, once again, this is extremely important, why the public cannot have a direct say in these decision-making abilities is also because the public does not care about long-term benefits. They do not care about polar ice caps melting or the protection of keystone species because it simply does not affect them in the short term, which is what the public is going to be concerned about. Unlike these environmental scientists who can work very well together with such a diverse team of scientists to actually ensure that that the long-term benefits are well taken care of to ensure that we do have sustainable development. And finally, politicians are good at making speeches, experts are good at making policies. So let's let people do what they're good at to ensure that we can actually develop sustainably. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome Sai to the front to deliver the second speech for side opposition here.
Okay, I will be taking POIs by a virtual raise of hands between the 3rd and 7th minute of my speech. With that, I will begin a self-timer. Just give me a second. Okay, on a self-count of 3, 2, 1. Thank you, adjudicator. Firstly, I'd like to rebut the basis of the premise, like the premise of their argument. Firstly, the fact that environmental policy, their definition is completely incorrect and forgets that resource extraction is an integral part of the environmental issues that are caused in today's world, right? In our model, environmental policy, when it's drafted by politicians, will not be limited to one policy that exists in a vacuum. Rather, it will encompass other things that directly affect our environment in a great way, right? This includes industrial policy and agricultural policy. When they say that resource extraction is not included, they're forgetting that fossil fuels is resource extraction, and that's a huge form of detriment to the environment. They are forgetting that industrial policy and agricultural policy are important components of environmental policy, which can only be viewed in a broad manner and which can only be done by politicians. Secondly, they believe that environmental issues exist in a vacuum, they're isolated, right? That is completely not true. They directly impact the citizens. And in fact, when they believe this assumption and move forth with it and present their model, it's going to make the issue worse, right? This will be my first constructive, which I will go to shortly. And lastly, they assume that environmental issues, okay, I'll get to this in my 4th point as well. They assume that politicians and the people are completely incompetent and have no skill when it comes to, making informed decisions. And this is literally, that's a very extreme assumption that they've not been able to prove, which our side has said is undemocratic, right? Remember this, that today, all the major climate agreements in the world, whether that's, for example, the Paris Climate Accord or sustainability development, was formed by a committee of politicians who have knowledge that isn't just limited to science, but to the whole world. Now, coming to my constructives, my first one being that our side politicizes these issues, right? Now, by politicizing it, they will obviously rebut it by saying that, oh, there's partisanship that exists in politics and that's a problem. But actually what we're saying is that integrating environment as an essential political issue, which it is actually more beneficial in 3 ways. Firstly, the fact that politicizing this issue will hold politicians responsible for ecological priorities, not just in environmental law isolatedly, but in all the laws that are passed in the government. And this is, you can see this example in various countries, whether that's New Zealand, Austria, Belgium, Ireland, countries where the Green Party is in power, right? The minute you make environment not an isolated issue, rather a political issue that it affects each and every single person in the country, it becomes the responsibility of politicians to act on it and to make decisions that actually help the environment. Next, it's going to create a social paradigm shift, ensuring mass action, which is not present on side proposition, right? Think about developing countries, think about India. Let's say you have this panel of scientists and we follow your model, right? It is not going to reach the majority of people. The people who will understand the philosophy behind this are the well-educated upper class people who have the abilities to understand such scientific concepts, right? It's not going to pervade down to the mass level. And that's a huge problem in developing countries where most of the people are uneducated. But guess what? Politics is something that pervades down to even to the individual level and affects every single person, right? When you integrate environment as an essential political issue and hold politicians accountable, it's going to create a system of mass political action and activism, right? Think about things like the daylight savings in Canada, or going vegan, going zero waste, reducing carbon emissions. These have now become political issues, right? There are protests about this. That is because we understand it's a political matter. It's not just a scientific matter. Lastly, our side has greater impact, right? Let's, as my first speaker already said, let's take that best case scenario that scientists possess the acumen. Our advisory board has that, and we are not going to say that this the advisory board's suggestions will just be disregarded, because politicians have a lot of stakeholders to help, and they're going to take these decisions into consideration so long as it doesn't harm other stakeholders. Now, let me rebut a very important case they made, the fact that environment is our main stakeholder. The only people who are going to care about the environment and not their selfish needs are the scientists. Now, and with this, I will also be rebutting their argument about policies not having long-term effects, right? Now, let me tell you something. We agree that environment is our main stakeholder, but who are the people who are affecting the environment? It is the citizens, right? The environment does not exist in isolation, and policy alone can't save the environment, right? People, any policy, for it to be useful and for it to have a long-term impact, needs to be accepted by the people. The only way it is going to be accepted by the people is A, if people feel a political connection with the issue and feel a connect with the issue. B, if they feel that this issue is being made by representatives that they have elected, and so on and so forth. And C, if they feel that this issue is something that's being done with their consent and that actually is relevant to the matter at hand, which is going to be done by our politicization. So in our model, when politicians pass these laws, they have a greater chance of convincing majority of the people to accept them, to actually implement them. And so our main actor in this model is the people. Because of this, these policies are going to last long term. Because of this, they're actually going to work, right? And then they talked about how, scientists won't consider international relations and policies in mind. They'll just do what's best for society as a whole. Let me tell you that that is just not going to work, because if you act in a vacuum and do one thing that is environmentally proper and conscious, there are other things that need to be balanced out, which politicians do, right? If you act on something where you solve climate change, say, entirely by completely banning plastic in every single country of the world, I'm giving an extreme example, but I'm trying to prove a point here, then it will have huge economic impacts. It will have huge impacts on industry. It will have huge impact on private players, right? So you need to understand that though scientists have this knowledge, you need to balance out a lot of other stakeholders, and you need to appease to the people. Why do politicians appeal to the public? Not just to win elections, because that's how you get a policy to work at the ground level, right? Now, I have one last argument before my speech ends. Before that, a POI, yes?
If I could give that POI. Does the speaker realize that the majority of current environmental policies are already crafted by these experts and are only endorsed by these politicians? And having these experts have their own panel could be
thank you, speaker. I got your point. But that is exactly why we are promoting our advisory board, because we do understand it's crafted by experts and endorsed by politicians. We are in our model, we have an advisory board that is crafting these policies. We are not saying that every politician has full knowledge on it, but we are saying that we need to respect the democratic principle of countries and people's right to choose their things. Lastly, they talked about how I want to bring up how this sets a dangerous precedent in terms of if you have scientists do environmental policy, because Prop conveniently stated that, oh, only environment is objective and only that can have specific lawmakers, and all other things are subjective and they don't need specific lawmakers, right? Any other person, whether that's healthcare rights, whether that's abortion rights, they are going to bring up the exact same argument of Prop and say that every single individual aspect of society needs to have a group of experts who will make the laws. And that way the entire system is going to collapse, because that's not the logical approach to such issues, right? None of these issues exist in a vacuum. All of these issues exist politically and exist intersectionally with other issues, and that is why we have lawmakers and policymakers who draft policies for every single issue in the world, and not isolated groups of experts. And with that, I conclude my speech. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much. 1 second. Yes. Now I'd like to welcome Vyas to deliver the third speech for side government. Here.
Thanks. I'll just take a small minute to gather my points.
Sure.
Chair, just a request, if you could just write 1 when the first minute ends for the speaker.
Yes. Sorry.
Thank you.
I sometimes tend to forget that a little bit. I'm used to other people taking the time for me. Otherwise, I'm using the Debate Keeper app. And if you hear that ding, that is also, and I haven't written it in chat, it does mean that the first minute is over. But I'll try to think of it and actually write it in chat.
All right, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm ready. I'd just like to make sure that I'm completely audible and visible.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I'll be taking my POIs verbally. Please feel free to interrupt me. I will be starting my speech in, wait 1 second. I'll just set up my timer. I'm so sorry. Excuse me. Yes, awesome. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We've heard several arguments from team opposition, but they all seem to have one major logical fallacy, and that is the kind of environments we're talking about. In our very first speech, we gave you a more nuanced argument. We recognize that there are different kinds of environmental policies that affect the environment in different ranges. And we are specifically creating this committee for one purpose, and that is to talk about long-term environmental change. Because we recognize that all best policies to solve major environmental problems are long-term in nature, and that the main arguments that we've gotten as a rebuttal from team opposition is short-term policy. They tell you that when you make environmental policy, it's going to directly impact the people in the short term, and therefore we shouldn't make it. However, our first speaker gave you our entire model and how this feature, how the entire concept of our model works, how we will not be focusing on major short-term incentives such as I told you, resource incentivizations such as carbon fossils, but rather long-term incentivizations. And we recognize that this is, in fact, the best way to deal with such environmental issues, which I will be elaborating in my clashes. I'll be covering 3 clashes in my speech. Firstly, is people not being able to vote on long-term environmental policies inherently bad? So my second clash on why are scientists democratically suited to take such decisions? And thirdly, the converse of are political entities suited to take these decisions that are best for the environment. Now, on to the first clash is people not being able to directly vote on such issues actually a major inherently bad issue, or does it have its own benefits? To which we give you the analysis. All the best policies tend to be long-term in nature. We tell you that climate change cannot be solved in a day by banning plastic or solving the carbon fuel problem. And we also recognize that issues like carbon fuel have to have a gradual shift in the economies, and they also actively affect the people. And we tell you, when we still consider democracy the best entity to deal with issues that directly affect the people at the grassroots level, which is why we still leave these kind of decisions to politicians, which is why we don't engage these decisions. They tell you that we don't talk about anything to do with carbon fossils. No, we leave those decisions to politicians, because on our side of the house, we recognize that that politicians are an effective entity to deal with these kind of issues. However, we also recognize more importantly that such kind of issues will not solve climate change. Such kind of issues will not heal the environment magically, because the real issues that really heal the environment are fundamentally long-term in nature. Issues such as the ozone layer or the Arctic glaciers melting that do not affect the voters right now immediately. There is no direct impact felt for them right now. And therefore, we also give you voter analysis on how, if an issue does not directly affect voters right now, they are unlikely to actually pressure politicians to vote for it. And furthermore, how it will affect the voters in the future if they do not care about it now, how the citizens will be affected in the future, which is why this committee is necessary. It is necessary to care about long-term futures that politicians do not bring up, about situations where these politicians will not be pressured by the voters because they are not directly affected by it, but furthermore are still necessary because of the long-term decisions. And once again, we stick by the narrative that all best policies are long-term in nature. If there are any POIs, I'll take it now. If not, I will move on with my speech.
Yes. Are there any sectors other than environment that actually require long-term policies? And why is your case not specific to them as well? And also the fact that how if the social
Definitely, I got your question. We definitely recognize that multiple sectors do have long-term policies. However, they also have short-term implications, right? They have long-term policies, but they also have short-term implications. Here we have left the short-term implications of environment to politicians. However, we recognize that even the long-term policies of other sectors will have immediate changes. Right? When an environmentalist makes a long-term policy, the changes will not be seen immediately. When they make a short-term policy, the changes will be seen immediately. Whereas in the case of other sectors, when you make even a long-term policy and a short-term policy, in both cases, the changes will be seen immediately. And that is not the case with environmental long-term policies. That is important when you look at the characterization of what environmental long-term policies are. They are slow, gradual processes. That is not true for the long-term policies of other major sections such as traffic regulations or economic policy. These things will impact the people right then, right now, even if they are long-term in nature. That is not true for long-term environmental policy. Glad to have started that out. Moving on to my second class of, are scientists democratically suited to take such decisions? So now they give you the entire crux of their argument about the social contract. They tell you that it's fundamentally and morally wrong based on democratic view because their policies are going to fail because they're unrepresentative. They don't take into the views of the people. They don't care about, more importantly, other industries, and that there is no accountability on our side, that our actors are not incentivized correctly. So let's talk about the concept of incentives. We'll give you two major responses to this. Firstly, if you listen to our model, we do have incentives, and which is the same form of incentive that you have, which is the people. Much like how they actually compared our model to the judicial system of the United States. While it's not specific to the United States, but rather most democratic nations, we kind of agree with this comparison because we do recognize that they are also incentivized by the same things that these judicial entities are incentivized. The legislation, no thank you, these legislations and the most government entities. We recognize that these are really important, that such government entities manage to apply pressure on them because we still give you the ability that these governmental entities can impeach such scientific entities if they are not working in the progress of the people. We recognize that still provides the same incentive. And furthermore, we'll give you further analysis on moral incentive. We recognize that such entities are incentivized morally. No, thank you. That they're incentivized morally as well. They're incentivized morally as well because they study concepts such as environmentalism. They know objectively that what they're doing works for the best interest of the environment. They know for a fact that what they're doing will help the environment as a whole. The politicians, however, are simply not working in the same field, the same job, however, to have the same moral incentivization, which is why it's more likely that that they have a moral incentivization. And in case this moral incentivization fails, we also have the other object. And then they did give you the precedent of objectivity, where our argument can be applied to any other field in the world. Once again, that serves to be false. Because if you consider most other forms of legislation that politicians work on, it is not something that is objective. It is something that's very subjective, such as economic policy. Economic policy varies between people on actual taxation issue. Most of the issues that politicians deal with affect people on day-to-day life. Unfortunately, environment is not one of them. It is something where there is a right and wrong answer, where what is good for the environment and what is bad for the environment isn't something that people have voted on. It is something that can be objectively decided, which is why it's very clear on objective committee who should take such decisions. And it should not be up to people to vote on what is the best. It would be absurd for a person to vote on who makes the best doctor. Moving on to class 3, are politically taken decisions best for the environment? So let's once again look at short-term versus long-term incentives. They tell you that politicians definitely do take all kinds of long-term actions because they will always lead to better actions. The problem is, once again, if you look at the kind of long-term actions they take, these long-term actions are going to be implemented immediately and they're going to be in effect for a long-term duration, but the actual course of action of these long-term policies are not going to be gradual. They're going to be immediate and sustained for a long period. Whereas the actual course of action for long-term environmental policy is going to be long-term in nature. They also give you the analysis that our side, the scientists that we have on our side will not care about foreign objection and all that. The problem here is that they tell you we have to weigh between two major factors here. We have to weigh between what they claim as social intelligence, as the ability to anticipate people, as compared to our scientific and objective intelligence, which actually values the environment. The difference here is that, let's look at, in their best case scenario, they're doing what's good for the people agree with their decisions, and they're consulting their advisory board, and they are still endorsing their decisions because it doesn't affect other stakeholders, and everybody is happy in their work. Problem is, these decisions that even the advisory board are going to make that don't affect any stakeholders whatsoever, or do affect stakeholders in long term, are going to be short term in nature. Whereas our decisions are going to be long term. And once again, we stand by the notion that long term decisions are the best for sustainable development. We stand for a world where sustainable development is prioritized over short term whims. We're proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I would now like to welcome Sneh to the front to deliver the brief speech for side opposition here.
So I'll just take a few minutes to gather my notes.
Also, because our microphone is on, in case you're wondering, there is a thunderstorm outside. I hope it's not too distracting. Thunder is slowly creeping up. All right. Yes.
All right, starting in, oh, I need to put my own timer. Right. I'll be taking all my POIs virtually. So if you have a POI, just raise your hand, I'll take it. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Before I go to my clashes and the best case, worst case scenario, and also all the rebuttals for the website, we first of all need to acknowledge the unique benefit that we provide and the unique harm that is present on their side of the house. Something that they A, haven't pointed out, and B, though we did implicitly imply it in the first two speeches, they haven't rebutted it very clearly, right? But first of all, coming to the idea that we at side opposition would be able to give you a much more holistic approach to the establishment of environmental policies, right? So what does that look like? This looks like policies coming culturally as well as economically feasible from the side of the government itself, right? But why is that necessarily important? Because we feel, as our second speaker also emphasized, that longevity of policies is based upon the efficiency of those policies as well, which is established by the cultural value of those policies, the way the public reacts with those policies, and the way the economic benefits are reaped out of them. That's why if a policy is very good and it's affecting the public in the very best way, then the government tries to extend it and tries to make it better just so that they can get the votes in the form elections, just so that they can win the elections and get power, right? And why is that important and why is that essential to the debate? Because A, this means that we have an accountability system in which the government has a fear of not being re-elected, whereas the scientists on the other hand do not have an accountability system, something that we, our side of proposition again and again, but we did not get a clear model as to what exactly is the case and how exactly are these people going to be held accountable. But the unique harm on their side of the house is a lack of democracy and a lack of accountability. Now, I do understand that I've already talked about lack of accountability, but lack of democracy is very essential, right? Because lack of democracy also means lack of interaction with the particular stakeholders that we're talking about. We feel that environment, though being an important stakeholder, it can only be impacted if we take another stakeholder, that is the public, at the very forefront. That means that if we involve the public in the entire process, then this is the only way we can actually form good environmental policies. The very moment the public does not exactly is participating in the entire environmental policy, is not heard regarding the demands and regarding the problems that they're facing, then the public also disconnects with the entire policy and the entire policy's longevity fails, right? But coming over to my first theme of the entire debate, which is about the knowledge that is between the scientists and this public. Second being that is it direct, the impact that we're talking about. And third being the social contract, the stakeholder, and the accountability, all three together. But coming over to the theme one, right? What is knowledge and is it required? Now, this is something that we characterized in the second speech as well, something that speaker 3 did not rebut, and now they can simply do it in their reply speech, right? And what is that? It is the knowledge is based upon an holistic approach of things. If a lack of knowledge of a few things would have stopped politicians from taking decisions, then we would not have politicians existing at all in our countries. If we would have restricted politicians from, let's say, taking decisions upon the basis of knowledge that they have, we would have not exactly have any politicians in the very first place. The very reason we elect politicians is the fact that A, they understand the social construct of a society, but B, they also understand the economic implications, the economic impact of the society itself, right? But why is this very essential? Because of A, these scientists are somewhat going to impact other sectors, these other sectors who now have a very valid argument of saying that this entire model is not democratic, actually giving the anti-climate change, the anti-environment narrative that can actually stand. But B, the also the fact that these social construct and economic understanding, it does not exist, would actually face such severe opposition from the public that its longevity, its effectivity would reduce, right? But also the fact that what is the politicians and the people's efficiency has been longly understood, because the longevity of the matter is the fact that these people understand and are impacted by these policies. The issue with stakeholderism is that we need to acknowledge the amount of effect that it has upon individuals, but also the fact that if it is not culturally, socially, and economically coherent, then the chances of it being effective, let's say in 2 years, is very less, right? But also, let's first of all go to my second theme. Is it direct? Is the impact that we're talking about direct? And honestly, it is. But even if it isn't, let's take side proposition at the best case, right? Let's say that the impact is not direct. Then still the exact idea of longevity of impact and the very factor that to have that longevity of impact, the process right now would be affecting individuals. That is to say, to reduce down carbon emissions, some industries would be getting affected at the short term way. Then the very idea that they're part of the process puts them into the spotlight, right? And that's the very reason why we actually have all this stakeholderism in regards to various issues, right? That's why we ask the public in regards to the military, whereas we don't exactly know that when is it going to happen, right? If we're accumulating weapons right now, the idea of its impact are definitely in the future and are not immediate. Current political tensions lead up to that. But also the fact of industries such as mechanical industries or agricultural industries, the way they're established are based upon the economic understanding of individuals, based upon long effects, and still people actually indulge into these activities. Just putting forward the idea that longevity of matter somewhat reduces the efficiency of individuals to understand the issue is simply assertive, and we haven't even understood from side proposition or side that why is it necessarily the case, and B, that why is it actually correct for them to undermine democracy, because it simply isn't. Why is it not correct for them to undermine democracy? Because A, democracy ensures participation of stakeholders, but B, democracy also ensures that these people are held accountable, that this social contract that we're talking about is established, right? But what exactly is the social contract again? Something that I'll be talking about in my theme 3. Now, we again and again told you that social contract is somewhat present between the government and the people have a responsibility to report to that government, to act for the policies of that government, right? Let's just presume that the scientist was able to push out the best policy in the world with a holistic understanding of whatever is happening in the world. It would still not work because A, that scientist does not have a social contract with the public. So the public is not exactly forced, or the public is under no obligation to act according to the scientist policy. But B, the stakeholder in this entire debate, that is the public, hasn't been exactly fared well by side of proposition, right? Because we already told you in our first speech as well as our second speech, as well as a POI to the second speaker, for which we did not get an exact reply, that this stakeholder is not getting interacted to. Now, what does that mean? That means that this stakeholder would not be treated in such a manner that it can be actually held on to, that it can actually be listened to. Before I move ahead, POI.
Thanks. Will the speaker engage with the analysis that most good decisions for the environment are long-term and do not show short-term growth?
I'm sorry, come again.
Do you recognize that most good decisions for the environment in terms of policy are long-term in nature and do not show short-term results at all? And this can only be achieved on our side of the world.
All right, so let's just understand the issue over here. We're not saying that the long-term effect of their side of the house is somewhat under threat. We do assume that the fact that this policy is actually going to be continued, that is to say the policy is going to continue to exist after 2 years, is under threat. Why is that the case? Because of the cultural tensions and the economic instability of this policy, just because of the fact that a scientist has made it, would make it impractical, would make it unimplementable, and that would be the main case, right? But also, let's just assume the best case. Let's say that this policy was very coherent in its nature and was so holistically implementable. Still, this would actually not be implemented because of the fact that federalism in its very instance fails in the effectivity of this policy, because the government, if in their side of the house still has the fact that their authority is being opposed by another private entity which does not exactly have a social contract with the people, would always oppose this policy and would not let it get effective in the very first place. But B, the fact that was already told by a very first key speaker that accountability for the lack of implementation of the policy, the very chance that this individual is, I'm just finishing up in a bit, the very chance that the scientist is somehow correct is not exactly taken into place and is not exactly held accountable, because we again don't have an accountability mechanism. But the fact that they initiated the fact saying that SCOTUS is somehow their model, let's just remember that Roe versus Wade got overturned today, and there is no way of accountability for the conservatives that did that, and that is the very same policy that they'll be implementing today. Very, very proud of.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the reply speaker for side opposition, here,
Yeah, just
to close the case for the entire opposition bench.
just give me a few seconds to collect my notes. One second, let me switch on my timer. I start in 3, 2, 1. A very good evening to everyone present here. I'm proud to be speaking for the opposition. Now, first of all, let's start off with outlining what the major points of the proposition were. Number one, they stated that the public and the politicians were completely incapable of making well-reasoned environmental decisions. Number two, they also spoke about how scientists work with the society's best interest because they have an inbuilt morality due to their subject, and their best interest always lies in the subject and the society. Number three, they also stated that policymakers are the main actor in this debate that will impact the main stakeholder, which is the environment. And number four, they conveniently also decided that only long-term policies are included in the debate. Now, let us also look at what the proposition has failed to note. Number one, they do not know that small drops make an ocean. Short-term policies are what is going to make an impact at the end, as the opposition has already stated. Number two, there is an absence of a system of checks and balances to ground their committee, their model in reality, and hold their model accountable. Number three, they also fail to note that environmental policy, even in the long term, as stated by the opposition, is intersectional and influential to individuals at a personal level. The opposition, however, has addressed all the points that the proposition has made, and has also made excess points that the opposition has not addressed at all in any of their three speeches. Number one, the opposition pointed out the flaws with Prop's model. We stated how their model does not have a system of checks and balances, and how their model will alienate environmental issues, which is central to entire humanity, from individuals that are the main actor which will be impacting the environment. Number two, we also created a model that gives a holistically efficient method of working, right? Because here we involve the people, we involve the governments, and it is socially, economically, and politically feasible. Number three, the opposition also clarified the debate is not on whether short-term policies are more impactful on long-term policies, but on whether politicians should make the policies regardless of whether they are short-term or long-term. Number four, we also clarified and stated how people is an actor that Prop ignored, is also the actor which is the main stakeholder in the debate. Number five, we asserted why our model has more accountability, which is pervasive and efficient. Number 6, we also characterize knowledge and made sure that our definition is inclusive of all the stakeholders present, unlike that of the proposition. We also highlighted why their point on the longevity of their policies is impractical. And we stated 3 major reasons for this. Number 1 is because their model promotes this narrative of the anti-environment people and people that do not believe in science, as stated in the first 2 speeches. Number 2, it also violates the social contract theory, which is a necessity for a stable nation. Number 3, it also creates deviance and revolt, because if people do not accept the policies, they are never going to be enforced. We also corroborated why individuals need to play an important part in these policies in all of our speeches. And we also outlined the dangerous precedents of having expert formulated laws to which the proposition has turned a blind eye. The opposition has won in all the major clashes. We have proved why the main actor in this debate is the common people, why politicizing environmental decisions is extremely necessary, why scientists are not politically eligible to make decisions, and why our model that we have stated has the necessary acumen to make decisions, and why involving the people in the decision making will make policies more effective and preserve the environment in the long term. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now I'd like to welcome the government reply speaker to the front, which is Guhan, to close side government and this debate as a whole. Here.
Thank you. I will begin my reply speech in 3, 2, 1. So there were many differences and contrasts here between both sides, team opposition and team proposition. At the very beginning, team opposition stated how the status quo on the advisory board is perfectly fine, while we at team proposition talked about how we set a proper model, which would be a far more efficient model to be followed. Secondly, team opposition talked about how politicians are far more socially adept than scientists, for which team proposition replied about why the environment can be far better handled by these scientists. Then team opposition talked about why no knowledge is better than half knowledge, and assumed that scientists have only environmental issues in mind, for which team proposition once again replied that the scientists will have the necessary knowledge and know how to pull this out, while also having the moral obligation to respect the wishes of the people. Then team opposition pointed out how scientists have very limited expertise in their own field and cannot bring about holistic development. While team proposition, while setting the very model, talked about how multiple fields with different view sides would be present in this council that would allow for a melting point of viewpoints and would allow for a really holistic policy legislature. Team opposition also talked about how legislation is chosen by the people and people will only listen to elected governments, and how this panel of scientists is not such an elected government. While team proposition already replied multiple times to that, talking about how we already defined that they are elected, maybe not directly by the people, but they are elected by the legislature, who elect the best of their field, who themselves are elected by the people. And therefore, while it may not be direct, it is still accountable enough. Then team opposition talked about how scientists, again, the scientist panel is not accountable, for which team proposition replied multiple times how they are accountable and have multiple incentives in the form of impeachment, and which is similar to the judiciary, which is a pretty accountable panel, as well as moral incentivization to bring about holistic development. Team opposition then talked about how politicians have better interests in mind, while team proposition talked multiple times about how politicians could not understand the scientific issues and do not possess the scientific know-how to understand these issues, and brought about that even in the best world of team opposition, that even if they do understand these issues, then the majority of them will still be interested in being re-elected rather than posing an actual long-term beneficial policy. Team opposition then continued talking about how team proposition, so that politicians people are completely incompetent, and this is not true, while team proposition clarified again multiple times that it is not incompetence that was being referred to, but instead a lack of knowledge in the required fields, not incompetence, but lack of knowledge in the fields that was specifically required to have these laws and policies. Team opposition then talked about how politically involving the people will make the politicians accountable to them and would allow them to pass good and beneficial environmental laws, while team proposition mentioned again quite a few times that in short-term benefits, it only benefits their very own term and not the long term. They may exist for these laws themselves may individually exist for a long time, but they do not inculcate long-term benefits, only short-term ones. And how politicians will only hold the office for about 4 to 5 years, or even if they are re-elected for a couple of terms, do not hold the office long enough to pose actual long-term accountability for their actions, while scientists, as we talked about, have far more long-term accountability. Team opposition then brought up how people who are going to be directly under and related to these laws, and how politicians have a better chance of connecting with these people and passing laws that the people will accept, while team proposition then rebutted by talking about how these laws can even be sidelined by the politicians, and how it is not an effective method, while long-term solutions definitely are, something that politicians seem not to consider. Team opposition then talked about how the other issues should have panels as well if team proposition's model stands, while team proposition again reviewed that, talking about how environmental issues specifically require policies that will manifest in the long term. It is more objectively sound than most other forms of the issues from other forms and areas, and these long-term benefits may not appear in the short term. Overall, team opposition's argument seemed to be about how politicians had a more holistic economic and cultural policy. I'll finish right now. I'll finish up. Team opposition's argument seemed to be about how politicians have a more holistic economic and cultural opinionation, while team proposition talked about how the most effectiveness is going to be drawn out by these objectively created policies. And specifically, opposition talked about lack of policy, which proposition again talked about how this is in fact respecting policy and democracy. And so with all this said, team proposition would like to close their argument. Thank you, and supremely proud to propose.
All right. Thank you very much, Guhan, and thank you all for a very interesting, very good debate. Just a very small reminder, after 8 minutes 15 or 4 minutes 15, I'm not allowed to write anything down. So unfortunately, there's decent chunks of quite a few speeches that unfortunately you will not be able to find in, including unfortunately the very topical reference, for instance, to the current goings on in the Supreme Court in the United States, or now the wonderful summary of government and opposition. All right, I will take a few minutes to pour through my notes to decide who the best speaker of this debate is and who ultimately takes it, and then I'll be back with you. All right. Good luck, obviously, although I will be the judge. But
thanks, Alex.
See you all in a second.
Sure.
Thanks, and good debate. I really enjoyed my experience.
Yeah, good debate. Thank you.
It was a very enjoyable, very close debate, I would say. So very good job.
Actually, it's a good time to reflect, and I was hearing you guys reflect yesterday also after the semi-final, some of you. So it'll be good to hear how you guys felt about it. How was the prep? I mean, considering the fact that this time I was watching, I mean, I can see a partial Chennai team, Hyderabad, I think Delhi also, different states coming in together and then suddenly making sure that the chemistry completely works. So it's phenomenal to be able to see that. So I get 4 Chennai debaters, 1 Hyderabad and 1 Delhi. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Lovely. So tell me how was the experience really? We love to get some bites from you.
Yeah, I think I'll hold to what I said. I really enjoyed it. Had good time. My experience with debating has once again grown. I've learned a lot and look forward to further opportunities.
Yeah, likewise. I think this tournament really gave me a lot of exposure because I was only used to debating at the inter-school level before. So sort of this national exposure is really helpful. And I think it sort of puts into perspective in how many diverse ways you can think about a topic. Because, initially it seems kind of straightforward, yeah, environmental laws, policy making. But the more you delve into it and the more you ask why, I think it brings up a lot of new points that you wouldn't have thought of before. So I think the kind of topic, the kind of exposure, it's great.
I would agree with that. I would say throughout the debate, throughout the semifinals and the finals, I was really surprised by the ways the opponent team brought out their viewpoints and the constructives, and it really did surprise me. I didn't expect that. So as Sai said, it was good exposure. I did feel like many of these viewpoints are very diverse. They had a lot of variety. So it was very enjoyable, and I look forward to debating here again later on, obviously. But again, really good experience, and thank you for conducting this competition.
Completely agree with them.
It was a great experience working with people that I didn't know, because whenever I go to debates, it's usually with friends that I'm extremely comfortable with. So getting to know two amazing teammates and working with them, and really having a view into how other people's mind works that are not from the same circle as you was honestly great. I had a great time in the debate. In the semis as well as the finals, the the opposing team gave a really tough fight and made the debate fascinating, very interesting. So I had a great time overall.
Likewise, so it was great knowing Sai, it was great knowing Sheryl, two girls from Hyderabad and Chennai and Delhi. I did not expect us to have that amount of coordination. But yeah, the cultural barriers or any sort of thing did not come in between. I'm just thankful for Ogly organizing this event and actually putting such diversity into one team, because we were able to actually understand what is the issue at its crux. So a pan India perspective, that was very, very helpful. But also the fact that we got great opponents. Hats off to team proposition in this debate and hats off to team opposition in the previous debate. They were pretty good. And also to all those children who were participating in the qualifiers. Those two were providing great analysis and great rebuttals to the entire system. And it's actually a reflection of the way Indian debate has grown, has actually spread to the entire country, spreading from the southern side to the northern side and to the western and to the eastern side. And it's just so good that we have such institutions working together to make debate more accessible to all students. So hats off to that, and thank you for organizing this event.
Sure.
Agreeing with what Sheryl said, whenever I debate, it's usually with people I know. So it's so refreshing to see so many new faces, and like ultimately you realize that debating is all about how you think, and your like background really doesn't matter. And like I think that's something that only this can provide such a experience. I'm so thankful to be a part of this entire competition because I've gotten to meet so many amazing people through it, and I'll always treasure that.
Yeah. And we treasure the fact that Nandana, I think your school was very supportive and putting it on the social media as well. Right. So I'm going to definitely tell my team to do individual splashes of all of you semi-finalists and finalists so that you can encourage your schools to do it. Because I think somewhere, in that sense, in the high school bracket, you are setting the benchmarks for the students who are watching you. They must be privy to your successes. And I think, all of you sitting over here is quite commendable. So I'm so glad you are enjoying the format that we put together, because that's what we realized. I mean, for me, I'm fiercely competitive. So when I saw so much of world debating completely dominated by Canadian, Philippine teams, I'm like, where is our debate team? Where is this country's mind team? Aren't we supposed to be the argumentative Indians? So let's put some structure around this. So I'm so glad.
A thing I'd like to add to that, if I may, is that I'd like to congratulate Team Ogly for the kind of motions you guys gave us.
Yeah.
Kamal sir and Anshli ma'am, because like in the first round, I'll let you all in on a little secret. I Google searched the motions and I literally couldn't find them anywhere. And I think to sort of raise that standard, I love the aim of Ogly to raise that standard debating in India, but the way you're doing it by challenging students and to make us think in different ways, I think that is commendable. All the motions in the first round, the semis, as well as this one, I think they were really good.
And you'll see, you'll see the collateral benefits like this, the collateral damage that you will create to the peers and the educators around you, and the collateral benefits that you will surface yourself. But I'm really serious about it, to say that, when we built something like this, we were very clear that we must make sure that every corner of the country is represented. And that's why Indian Debating League pretty much started with trying to put a state team and a union territory team, which means that 36 teams across all grade categories competed. And we will obviously replicate that format, but it's lovely to get cross-regional, cross-national teams together, because, you don't know in your sitting local circles that, I didn't realize that somebody is actually much better than me sitting somewhere else. So we will come back to you and say, listen, lead your circles, lead your groups. And India is definitely going to be hosting the World's Business Debating Championship, WSDC, but you'll hear more about it as we go along. I'm sure right now we are all fingers crossed, legs crossed for the results that are coming up. So my very best wishes to the best team there. I'm sure you have.
Actually, just adding up to what Sai said. So the first bonding point that me, Sai, and Sheryl had was regarding your emotions only. And my first reaction was that no, these are not normal emotions. These are not emotions you find on Hell Emotions. This is someone with a very, very unique and a very, very good mind sitting behind his laptop trying to roll out these complicated corporate, private, plastic, whether or not you should do this or is it actually harmful. And those type of motions actually set everything in perspective. So yeah, this was actually quite a good experience.
Sneh, you must read that Road versus Wade, page number 184, the dissent that is coming. I mean, I'm just so furious, but I mean, I'm so glad you brought that point up. Let's hope Calix takes that on. But yeah, I mean, yes, obviously, this is the Nitisha and team who are putting the motions across. I enjoyed your motion the most actually, because I was more worried that prior to 2 hours, will it catch you off guard? You know, environmental policies is different from the motion that we gave you. But yeah, let's see how that goes.
We would also be remiss if we didn't congratulate Oakley for getting such distinguished adjudicators every single time. After every debate, the part which I most look forward to was the feedback session, because when I started debating back in 9th grade, my school's debate club had said, whatever happens, regardless of how you do a debate, even if you don't listen to the debate, listen to the feedback session, because that is where a debater learns the most. And I think Ogley really proved that to me, because all of the feedback sessions that I've heard through my debating experience in Frankenstein, they're extremely fruitful, they're extremely helpful, and I did incorporate whatever I learned into my other speeches. So,
though I must say, this was very aggressive a format, huh? We went very quickly from qualifiers to semi-finals to finals. But we'll do a slightly more patient one with the British parliamentary ones which are coming in, where we end up doing 4 rounds of feedback. And I'm telling you, it was amazing to hear our debaters in Oxford Union having incorporated feedback. That's where you sort of enjoy it, right? Once you master the subject and you realize that actually the underdogs can win. Because it's not so much about the knowledge, because British parliamentary is 15 minutes on the spot. So in that 15 minutes, you're looking for the college and the room you have to go and debate and thinking through the motion. They were walking and talking, you know. So yeah, I mean, you'll love that. So I can see that you put Calix on the spot, huh? He's really furiously calculating, I can see. Good on that. So thank you so much, spectators. Please feel free to switch on your cameras as well. This is a informal session time, and really we'd love to sort of see who's invested the time, because needless to say, feedback being given to anybody and everybody is valuable. Go and do a look at the YouTube. Our YouTube channel has lovely decks and sessions on reply speeches specifically by Calix. I didn't want to say it before the debate. I said they've just got 24 hours to prepare for the motion, so let them do that. That itself is good. Yes. Yes.
All right. Okay, I'm roughly ready. And first of all, please be a little bit forgiving. This is my 3rd debate in a row. And it was a very complicated debate with a lot of points interacting differently. And there's enough for me to talk about for many hours, specifically also on how some arguments that didn't ultimately properly figure into this call, how they could have been made useful, for instance, and also some which parts of them worked, which parts of them didn't work, and strategic prioritization. A lot to be said. It was quite a close debate and a quite a high level debate. And ultimately it was, ultimately I decided to give the win to side opposition, with the best speaker quite closely being the Prime Minister, so relatively closely over the opposition whip. So it was a very engaging, interesting debate throughout. Okay. Ultimately, what it boiled down to was that government gave me a very clear case of environmental issue is unique because of its longevity, which therefore doesn't map with the interests of the public and politicians, which therefore means we need an additional body that is somewhat independent, but democratically accountable through the one-time vote, the long-term appointments with impeachment process for this kind of council of environmental experts, the constellation of which has changed a little bit over the speeches to incorporate rebuttal, as you built in this idea of, hey, we'll have different fields represented too. one point, by the way, that by the way, just from the get-go is a little bit risky, because of course, as soon as you put in additional experts that are from different fields, you also dilute your own impact, right? So therefore, the pure environment long-term processes will also, at least to some extent, it does come at the cost of your direct, clear impact in that regard. Okay, but anyways, we got that case pretty solidly. The core points that you basically, argue with is, one, the issue is very grave, climate change and climate change. There you don't expand that much upon why it is in people's unique long-term interests, even if they would vote against it in the short term. That is something that is deeply missing, and that's something that opposition does capitalize on. That's going to be a crucial point. And then the second point is this idea of a unique long-term indirect impacts on people, that therefore also means that you need scientists. I think the most interesting and strongest points that you have within this is your analysis on interests and of politicians and their short-termists, and how there's a certain problem with greenwashing, etc. What opposition, though, ultimately does convince me of is that the lack of perceived, at least democratic accountability, will particularly impact implementation, and B, also they give me enough analysis on why very crucial also, government, you do, like, while I do think the strongest material you have is on the interest analysis, I do feel like you waste a lot of time on emphasizing the knowledge that scientists have compared to politicians. In the first speech, this is fine, but the leader of opposition already with the counter model does bring in why the consultation aspect will still be there by the scientists, and you don't really have a response then why knowledge then is the key factor if that is accessible. I think here it would have made a lot more sense for you to double down very heavily why politicians just won't be able to do that because of their short-term interests, and why the public will be deceived and therefore we won't get issues. That plus again, I've also mentioned how you spent relatively little time on analyzing exactly why, because climate change is such a huge international issue that goes beyond borders. This was a really interesting piece of analysis that you had, that politicians care about their own people that elect them and do not care beyond that. That is something that you could have made a lot bigger and ultimately constructed a lot more as a legitimate overarching need that needs to be addressed regardless of people's short-term interests. That was a bit of a problem. So opposition does a few things. They first bring up this entire idea of democratic accountability, and that it at least feels less democratically accountable, which is fair, though it is though you do mitigate it by saying, of course, hey, we elect them once. Obviously long-term appointments and impeachments for hardcore scenarios aren't, you can still see why the democratic accountability is a bit smaller, and opposition do a great job of working that out. That being said, opposition, please be careful with social contract analysis, because ultimately this contract obviously doesn't exist. And also when judges hear John Locke, they sometimes tend to turn off a little bit, especially because John Locke himself doesn't prove consent well. Like he talks about, but we enjoy the merits of our society, so therefore we all agree to it. We would be allowed to make a different choice, right? But ultimately, I still think it worked well enough in this debate to illustrate this idea of what people expect of those structures governing them, and why it influences the way that they interact with those laws, and particularly also how they will be counted. In particular, your points on these laws being less well implementable and less government not proving to us that these laws will stick around. So the longevity analysis were ultimately kind of the tipping point why I believe that government doesn't get to unlock their unique benefits, and specifically why, in addition to that, it may be legitimate for us to prioritize sometimes economic issues that are very direct and short term. Here's where the actually whip analysis comes in quite well. I do consider it rebuttal, so it's legitimate, but because it also was set up interactively with government, but it was quite close to new material when you started talking about how immediate impacts will actually be felt on industries and etc. And this came a little bit late in opposition, but also bringing in this idea that that also resource extraction would be covered. By the way, that was a nice try on government side, but I fear you can't fully crop out, like frame out this idea of resource extraction because it is so incredibly critical within this. So I think like in strategical terms, government, I think you should have been a lot more bold in terms of what restrictions it means, and then engage a bit more strongly in this idea of why is this overarching issue worth sacrificing some democratic accountability and maybe even short-term interests that may seem legitimate. Notice, for instance, if you're 75 years old and you may not feel the impacts of climate change, but you still have a very strong interest in your own material condition. On proposition side, you need to be brave enough and to tell me, screw that old person, future generations need to have a world to live in. Like that is basically, and a bit bolder approach specifically to like be willing to engage with some of the sacrifices would have helped you a lot. Also, although again, biggest focus that I think was lacking was this idea of how do you prove that your policies will stick around and specifically will be implemented, because I think these were the attacks on opposition side that were most effective ultimately. Okay, speech by speech, sorry. I hope this was a little bit messy all over the place, but I think the picture is clear how I got to my decision. Okay, first of all, I'm Prime Minister. First thing I want to say is incredibly crystal clear structure. It was an absolute joy to follow you from point to point. It also you basically hit the spots that you needed to hit within your case structure very, very well. From of course, first of all, doing a clear definition, the nice strategical attempt to frame out extraction of resources, and then like a very detailed and pretty solid model. I think like you very quickly moved on to a wise analogous to the judiciary, which I think was quite powerful. Although here, good that you did include this idea of these people being impeachable, as Sneh, after the time that had already run out, has mentioned, the Supreme Court isn't necessarily always the best example in terms of checks and balances. Yeah, QED, United States, Roe v. Wade, and countless other decisions that we will see down the line because Donald Trump was able to pack the courts pretty effectively. These are things that the impeachment process somewhat mitigates and gets around. So also, yeah. That being said, solid model setup, that they are only called upon in times of need, I think was an interesting idea, but wasn't really necessary and didn't really add much to your case. I think a standing body would have actually been more impactful, because then you could argue more strongly for consistent, coherent policies that constantly also adapt to global changes, right? Because other governments will be doing things, and environmental long-term policy might have to adapt. But anyways, that being said, great modeling. Then also like a solid explanation of the incentives of politicians and scientists, although and also what long-term issues are. Again, biggest piece of feedback and criticism is to spend more time and emphasis on what the problem is that you're actually fixing. So what is the core problem? Paint us a picture of why climate change is unique and why it can only be fully addressed this way, and ultimately why. So because that is the core issue that you're solving. You went too quickly into these actors think like this, these actors think like this, therefore this issue can be addressed that way, and therefore on a more abstract level got countered by opposition. So beware to properly set up your problem in the beginning of your speech so that you can make sure that your case actually addresses the weakest parts of it and most properly exactly defends that. Because this way you became a little bit too over-reliant in the long term on just this idea of the short term versus the long term, and then on the question of which policies directly affect you versus which don't. Because yeah. All right. So that's Prime Minister. I'll try to be a little bit quicker. Okay, leader of opposition. Immediately came out with a counter model, which is essentially the status quo, as I think Deputy Prime Minister did reasonably point out, that you kind of use this knowledge and stay democratic. One thing that I kind of missed in your speech was the responses to the actual interests, of course, the actors involved. So after your speech specifically, when it came to came to this idea of your model solving it better, I had a lot of question marks that did need to be resolved a little bit later on the bench. Secondly, most of my feedback on how to set up social contract arguments again applies here quite well. Be a little bit careful how to use it. I would even, to be honest, not use the word social contract at all. I would immediately just explain what you're trying to say with it. So go in with look, for us to accept decisions made about our lives, we need to feel like we have agency over them. We need to feel like we're being asked about it, or that it's overwhelmingly in our interest. Elected judges elected for life do not do that. Politicians that we get to fire every 4 years do get to do that. So that's, and that way you get to the exact same point, just more efficiently, more quickly, and you also don't risk that a judge will immediately start rolling his eyes. Oh God, social contracts again, because small spoiler alert, in debating, there's a ton of social scientists mostly. You know, most people study sociology, politics, or philosophy, and people get sick and tired of social contract arguments and immediately start rebutting them a little bit in their head. So don't warn them about it. Just immediately get to the point of what kind of accountability do we demand. Beyond that, I think there was a very you did do a very interesting kind of even if case, that even if they get the best of their world, we at least get legitimate results, which thereby have some staying power and people care about. I think that was pretty solid. One thing that you could have also gotten a little bit deeper into is you do explain why you will have a more holistic views by politicians, and that the outcomes will affect everyone. Here, I think the more interesting question that we are going towards, but that you didn't quite establish, was more this idea of what is legitimate policy. So would it be legitimate for current issues to overshadow climate change? I think this, by the way, is a very bold ethical question that opposition would have also helped opposition to properly engage with. I think you could have quite very clearly engaged with, why do our direct needs matter more than future generations that might never exist? Also, you could have made more out of the uncertainty that even if scientists know the best about their fields, there's an uncertainty about what 30 years will look like, 30 years in the future would look like, or 50 years in the future would look like. So they're making probabilistic assumptions about what we need back in the future, about what we will care about in the future too, versus politicians that think about needs that we know that we have right now. That is something that I think you could have also engaged a bit more. But over across the bench, because each of you did go a little bit deeper into the ideas of into holistic approaches and weighing back and forth, it did become clear enough for me to credit properly that it is legitimate to also to prioritize other issues, specifically because government doesn't really respond much beyond this idea of expertise and long-term, short-term incentives. It did become clear that it probably is legitimate for stakeholders that care about mining, etc., to be consulted about things that affect their lives very strongly, and that they will provide a lot of resistance if they don't. Yes. Right. Anything else I missed? Yes. So basically, go a little bit deeper into that. Structure-wise, pretty solid and pretty clear. You in your announcement in the beginning. However, within your speech, sometimes it became a little less clear where exactly in your speech you were. So just make sure to re-announce exactly kind of what steps you are, what you want to do. And tiny little tip for everyone: the things where you want the judge to listen to most, just tell the judge. Just drop a short notice, judge, or judge, this is particularly important here. So do set your own emphasis where you want it to be, because the judge might set it differently. That being said, great speech, careful with social contract arguments, and keep your structure also within the speech, and make clear that the judge gets it. All right, let's move on to government whip. 1 second. Structurally and stylistically, it was an absolute joy to listen to. It was very nice to follow. I think my core criticism is again that you kind of you didn't emphasize the core weaknesses of your case and didn't patch up exactly where. Oh, first of all, I've been asked who the best speaker was again. Best speaker for me was the Prime Minister, closely above opposition whip. So mentioning that as a kind of like additional throwaway line. But anyways, government whip. Clear good structure. I think you also had a fantastic visualization of why these issues often are long-term and particularly not directly impactful, with the ozone layer and the idea of Arctic Circle, which did convince me clearly that there are issues that definitely fit within your mold, but it was difficult to kind of prove why that is the sticking point that only the environment does it. Opposition was, I think, quite decent at attacking that, and here again it was, I think, the wrong thing to really focus on in terms of the uniqueness of the environmental issue. Like, again, why is the environment the biggest thing for you to solve, and why does it allow us to gloss over other things? I think you needed a few more reasons than just short-term, long-term, and the feeling of direct impact on your life compared to indirect impacts down the line. Especially this is where opposition whip was incredibly effective, which you couldn't have known yet, but that was a vulnerability. Okay, beyond that, let me take a quick look. A lot of pretty solid also responses, just making quite clear that you do have some democratic accountability. This was yes, it's in chat now. Oh, also, of course, be a little bit more careful with accepting the idea of the Supreme Court of the United States as being a good analogy. But then again, your setup was very much as an independent judiciary, which was pretty solid. But yeah, current events, try to be always helps to be a little bit sensitive of what's happening there. Beyond that, I think you also, I mean, you repaired and doubled down like a lot of attack points of your team very, very effectively. For instance, about why people will prioritize day-to-day needs over long-term impacts. I think you very solidly brought that point home, made very clear that it's on-site government. The bigger problem, though, is that the question then still remains: why would it not be legitimate to respect the day-to-day short-term incentives of voters over the long-term incentives of like the general populace beyond borders? I think here again, focusing specifically on the international level, on the lack of cooperation of nation-state governments versus scientists having a bigger picture could have been a great way to kind of like sideline that. And I think in the third speech, it still wouldn't have been too late for that, especially given that it does get mentioned once by Prime Minister in the Prime Minister's speech, and then could have really been still actually expanded on. All right. Yeah, that's that. In general, good job. Mostly prioritization is where a little bit where the issues lie. Okay, opposition whip. Let me first make a quick look. All right, so I particularly like the fact that you immediately from the beginning of the speech honed in on the most crucial weakness in the proposition case, but in particular in terms of the feasibility, like how does this interact with the public, how does this interact with incentives, and why therefore won't it work? I think you make very abundantly clear, basically through a very destructive whip speech that could have used a lot more clear structure, to be fair, which is ultimately why structure was, I think, ultimately the tipping point for me between PM and you, because it was within your speech with some of the core some of the responses that I value most highly against government becoming most crystallized in your speech, and also the democratic default, ultimately how it impacts the world became clearest in your speech. Thus, helping anti-environmentalists message of non-accountability kind of like be pushed forward, plus adding the idea that people's compliance in the mid to long term and ability to ultimately repeal those policies will mean that government is moot because of that lack of accountability. Beyond that, it's also came a little bit late, but you also, which I appreciated a lot, finally gave the structured response on why there is an immediacy of impact of environmental issues. Until that point, that was still a bit more of an unsettled question within this debate that could have quite easily cost you guys the win. That was one of those areas where it was very close, and that became quite solidly, you won that clash quite solidly when you actually highlighted that and went into that. Let's see, is there anything else that I'm you could have maybe like what I could have seen a little bit more is maybe a little bit more, slightly more characterization and storytelling of how these things look. So what does it look like when the public doesn't get interacted with? What does it look like for a policy not to have sticking power? So while longevity was well enough explained, I'm still a little bit unclear on how exactly will a policy be lost now? How will they be repealed, or how exactly do people not comply with these laws? This specifically is, by the way, one of those areas where I think government missed a very important response that could have helped them a lot if government had actually responded a little bit more clearly. Why the threat of sanctions, the threat of actual punishment by the state organs if you don't comply with policy, and the idea that you can actually follow these guidelines will mean that people are incentivized enough not to follow them. And that alone would have made it a lot more difficult to assess whether actually policies can be effectively sabotaged. So especially when you talk about how people are disobedient with policies, or there will be backlash against it that will prevent it from being implemented well, do give us examples of, on the micro level, of how this may look. What processes do we think of there? Because this way it was still vulnerable to an effective response by opposition. I mean, by proposition, which could have tilted the entire thing. As you may have gathered from this extensive feedback, it was a messy debate, not in a bad sense, but in a sense of a lot of responses flying back and forth and needing evaluation. Finally, reply speeches. I'll be very quick. Right, first, opposition, Sheryl. Incredibly easy to follow, fantastic structure. My biggest issue here would be that it was a little bit too point by point on a micro level. Several of these clashes you could have summed up more effectively under first clash, this question, and now what are the sub questions of this. Within your structure, you could have pulled that off really well. This way, it was a little bit of a messy summary. I have here A, B, C, D, E, F, G in terms of responses to the. I know you said 1 to 8, but regardless, categories, subcategories. So if you boiled it down to 2-3 core questions, that would have been a lot easier. This way, still was very, very thorough and very clear, and time-wise, it did work out. However, especially if you run things the way that, like if you do reply speeches that way that you did, one thing that kind of gets a little bit difficult is there's no strong prioritization of which were the core, which were the most important responses and weighings. And you don't want the judge to make up their own mind about it. You want to tell the judge what the most important things on their mind should be. And specifically, if you do also separate it into fewer large points, you can prioritize by having the most important aspects of them in front, right? And of course, as I've mentioned before, then just drop a quick notice, most importantly, here, crucially, and with the Shashtal accents, you can make clear where you think the debate is decided and prime the judge that way. Okay, Guhan, your reply speech, a lot less structured than your prime minister's speech was by far. One big criticism here would be is that that it was a bit too much of a chronological summary bit by bit. They said this, we said this. They said this, we said this. It's incredibly difficult for me to see where the most crucial points to listen to are here. It's incredibly difficult to see which do you think were the most important questions that ultimately you answered. So yeah, structure there, and very similar feedback applies to the other reply speech. try to summarize along either 2 or 3 core clashes, or even if that doesn't really work in that motion, just thematic complexes. Here are the different aspects, the different categories. Just give us a clearer overview, because this way it's just stenographing and hoping that I figure out which were the most important things to listen to when I piece together my notes. But yeah, thank you all for a great debate.
So debaters, I know, come on, team government, switch on your cameras, good sportsmanship and a good smile for a photograph that we will take with Calix before I open it up to questions. So Calix, may I please click us in 3, 2, 1. All right, debaters, he's given you such extensive feedback. Any questions? Briefly, we are at 10:15 IST. Calix has been at it for 4.5 hours. Yes, Sneh.
Right. So regarding the characterization, I actually had it on my sheet, but I felt that because side proposition already talked about longevity so much, and probably because it was such an important thing to them, probably I did not need to characterize that why the lack of it is somewhat harmful to either of the sides. So was that a bad idea at large?
Kind of. So one thing, when one team talks a lot about one issue and really tries to force that issue, if you have the stronger material on it, it's perfect, because obviously they've staked a lot in that, right? So if you have a good response that directly engages with that, try to do it most effectively and strongly. That can work. It's a little bit of a strategical choice every time, right? Because if you feel like the argument isn't quite on your point, like on your side, then you don't want to waste too much time trying to engage a lost cause, right? In this case, though, it was very much not a lost cause, because they didn't prove the longevity of their policies. So you could have definitely used that characterization of, look, they care most about this idea of the issues being long-term and needing long-term solution. Yet they do not prove that these policies will stick around. Here is why they won't, and here is why they therefore cannot have that impact. So that is, I think, in this case, yeah, wrong decision. Though the impulse to be careful to engage with something that they talk about long with. In general, if they talk long about one thing, usually you have to definitely respond. But the impulse to not necessarily want to waste time if it's a lost cause is a useful impact. But just, I think the assessment of what material do I have here and how does it interact with them is always an important consideration. I don't have a great blanket solution for that. That's will be strategical calls that you'll make within debates that can turn out wrong or right. But your mindset is right here. Though again, to summarize, if they talk long about it, probably needs to be addressed. If you have very good material on it that they have not preempted, and especially if your opposition whip and they don't get to anymore, and you have a killer response, absolutely make 100% sure that the judge gets it. Sai? Oh, sorry, you've got another question?
Yeah, sorry, Sai, but yeah, just one other thing. Can you just provide like a example of a structure that could be followed by whips? Because I wasn't exactly able to get one from the semi-finals also.
Is it okay if we take this in a masterclass?
Oh,
or brief one, Calix.
Probably, I'd love to do one on that, but like I can do like 4 or 5 sentences very quickly on that. So with speeches, first of all, you have to find your own structure, the way it works for you. The clearest way, and that is most effective, is to maybe start out with, look, we need to show your burden. Our team proved to you this. This is the most important thing in the debate because of X. If they had wanted to win, they would have needed to do this. They did not. Now, what were the most important questions in this debate, and why do we win the most important ones of them? And then you go clash by clash, and that's like a very clear, easy way. In terms of note taking, then you can like do a few bullet points on what were the core points of their side, core points of our side, and then directly compare them. Although if it's like too many granular responses floating back and forth, doing it on an impact level on where does this leave the world, what happens to the world under their analysis, what happens to it under our analysis, and then just weighing them against each other. Which, by the way, is also how judges go about this, right? They ultimately take a look at what do these different cases result in, what's the impact on the world, and who therefore has the better contribution. So That would be an example.
All right, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Sai?
Yeah, I was just looking for individual feedback on my speech or the structure because I think it kind of lacked, like I messed up the structure at some point. So could you please do that?
1 tiny second. Oh, you already highlighted within your first sentences about the resource extraction and being how to call it involved. Sorry, I feedback that a little bit wrong earlier. That didn't only come in Sneh's speech, but again here it was also very short. Could have been dove into like 1-2 sentences deeper, and I think it would have helped. Beyond that, let me take a look. Yeah, I don't think you actually announced any structure in the beginning, and I think that is one of the core things. If we just, after you develop your arguments, go back to your sheet and then formulate headlines for them afterwards. That I think can also help you discipline yourself in terms of where you are in your speech and to follow your own structure. Otherwise, it's easy to hop back and forth a little bit because we think of responses while we're in the midst. We notice, this is something that I also needed to prove. You don't just use the structure to help your judge follow you, but also to discipline your own points and make sure that you speak about them in the right moments. I think that could help. Beyond that, I think one of the core issues though was in your speech, and I think this is also what made it difficult for you to stay structured, is that you try to run too many arguments that also were quite abstract on some levels. Like you spent a lot of time explaining the idea of having how to call it environmental policy as an integrated aspect of in the political sphere rather than an external one that is now in the hands of court bodies. That argument alone would have probably needed an entire speech, because for that one to properly run, you first need to prove, if you give this now to this body, environmental policy, at least on the long term, will now be taken out of the system. What happens? How do people think about this then? People think about this like something that is out of their hands now, so they don't vote on the basis of that. Which means that parties don't. You see a lot bigger argument than you were able to integrate into a speech where you try to like. So I think they're a little bit overly ambitious. So always be a bit aware of which arguments also efficient to take. So which arguments can you comfortably prove and get the biggest possible impact out of it? Because also with this is a potentially a really interesting case, but it would have been like an entire team case. Because ultimately you could try to then impact it in how does this completely change our political sphere? Why will Green parties be likely? Why do we have a good chance of policies to start, like environmental issues, to creep in every different area of policy making? And why will this then lead to an overall change of our society with climate change? Potentially incredibly strong case, potentially a winning case. That being said, rationalization, you have a limited time, and if the first speaker already makes depending on how the first speaker sets it up, like you set it up as a team, you already take a huge priority in what are the impacts that you most importantly want to prove. So even if you have a really fun and interesting and neat idea, don't be afraid to cut it out if it becomes too complex and doesn't perfectly mesh within the case. I think that is the biggest way that you could have given yourself an easier time, having a clear and a clear followable structure. Beyond that, okay, they take into account many stakeholders who need to accept policy. Yes, here again also prioritization. Pretty early on in your team line, you want to make clear which are the most important kind of attacks, which are the most important impacts that you're going for, right? And that is that people will not feel as democratic, therefore you will not get these things and they will disappear and you will not get your effectiveness, plus it's illegitimate to not take into account stakeholders' actual interests that matter and that may not be that long term. In your speech, by also in terms of order, you come to kind of very crucial and important kind of responses and setups about advisory boards and about whatchamacallit, and about citizens needing to accept policies and the politicians' balancing effects, which are all very crucial to your entire case. You do that in the second half of your speech, where you have the least flexibility and the least time to properly do it. So again, here, even if you have an interesting, neat argument that you're not sure will entirely work, but you want to run it anyways, even then, make sure that the more crucial stuff is early on in your speech. And here, the prioritization was exactly basically the wrong way around, with a lot of very interest. Also, especially also, you have this beginning rebuttal block, right, where you have a few responses to opposition, and then at the very end, you also come back to these ideas of other issues also basically fitting the criteria that government sets up of long-term impacts, not immediate impacts, and which, like the dangerous precedent argumentation about healthcare and abortion, etc. This is fantastic model criticism that should have been right at the beginning with the rest of your rebuttal. So invert your speaking, or to be a bit more careful with argument selection, because not every argument is feasible. Like, one of the harshest things to deal with in debating is just the fact that you have a huge time restriction.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Calix. Always a pleasure. And debaters, you know what you're up for when you're going to hear and be groomed by Calix. So we'll set up some of that with him later as well. Loved it. Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to close the finals for the Frankenstein debating competition, and see you guys again. I mean, this is a journey that you're on anyways, right? So we'll see you again.
Thank you so much. Congratulations to everyone for making it here, and of course to the winning team.
Yes. Thank you so much, Calix.